It's like first aid training. 6 months into it, it's like ABC, and something was about bleeding, I think. What was that again?
Yeah.
It's if you're not practicing it on a daily basis, you can't forget it.
Hey, and welcome to the Electrical Safety Podcast. I'm your host, John Travis, and today we're speaking with David Powers. David is an OH&S consultant who's got over 30 years experience, and it's so nice to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you very much, John. I appreciate being here.
That's great. So I always like to get started just to kind of give the listeners a bit of background on who the guest is. And so if you could kind of share your story on how you got into safety and sort of where that's led you in your career.
Wow, that's going back some time, but I got into safety, I think, like a lot of older professionals, kind of was voluntold to get into it. My background, actually, my formal background is in radio and television uh, broadcasting. And after working in that for a number of years, I met my wife and remember thinking at the time, okay, well, it's time to grow up. It's time to get serious now. I'm going to get a real job.
Mm-hmm.
And I landed a job with a small recycling facility in Toronto in sales. And a month into the job, my sales manager came to me one Monday morning and said, "You know what? We had a discussion over the weekend, and we thought you should be our health and safety coordinator. So as of today, you're going to be doing our health and safety." And I can tell you, John, I remember at the time thinking, I was less than impressed with that. I thought, ugh,
Mm-hmm.
health and safety. I thought, so if some guy in the back in the plant burns himself, they're going to blame me. It's going to be my fault. But to their credit, they sent me away for many, many courses. And it was in that time I started to realize that even though my background had nothing to do with health and safety, I was able to take the skills I learned in radio and television and apply them to health and safety. Because ultimately, health and safety is you have a message, whether it's electrical safety or lockout or working alone, whatever it is, and you're targeting it to an audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to do it through public speaking, through the written word, through video, different videos I've done over the years, and always with help from other people. Of course, it's always a team effort. But I started to realize pretty early on that, hey, this is interesting, and you can make a difference. And it's really for the protection of people's health and safety. Is that to the best of your ability? So haven't really looked back all these years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you next was, you got your start there, you had a sales job. How long did you spend in sales?
Oh, well, in sales, I was in for about 6 years.
Okay.
And at that time, I was also doing customer service and the health and safety.
All right.
So after, sorry.
I was just going to say, I was also thinking, you mentioned that through your background in radio and TV, but, I almost thought maybe some of that sales experience could be useful in health and safety as well. Cause
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the diplomacy skills that you pick up in sales that,
right,
that come in handy because, you're going to address senior management in a different tone than you are, folks on the shop floor.
right.
You're going to talk about, it's the same message. You're just slightly altering it for your audience, right? Um, and yeah, sales, how you approach somebody. And of course, there's almost always resistance when you want to introduce a new policy, a new procedure, or you're having people within an organization think of health and safety perhaps in a different way than they've traditionally thought. So there's a sales job right there to try to get them
Mhm.
to buy into, this is why I know you've done it this way for 30 years. And now I'm asking you to fill out 3 forms to continue to do it, but here's why, and here's the benefit, and this is why we're doing it. So yes, most definitely, the sales experience came in very handy as well.
Yeah. Okay. And then you mentioned you never looked back. So once you got into health and safety, that's what you've done since?
That's what I've done since.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I've done
Okay.
since.
And then so over the years, did you find, you mentioned, you've been doing it this way for 30 years and now you got to fill out 3 forms. That's always one of the things I find with safety in general is the challenge of getting buy-in from all levels of the organization.
Yeah,
And so in your experience, like what are some of the things that you've done to help, get buy-in and
I think probably I could sum it up in one word, and that's persistence. You have to be patient. You have to understand, particularly if you are introducing something new. You're not going to get it done overnight. You're not going to get it, overnight acceptance, or you may get it from senior management, but then you've got to trickle that down to your line management, to your, the workers themselves. And it's a combination. And I think at the heart of that, it's communications again,
Mhm.
right? Open communications, effective communications. It's explaining the context. Why are we introducing this policy on confined space? We've been doing it this way for X number of years. And hopefully we've never had an issue. Maybe we've had some issues in the past. And, you have to come up with a combination of, well, the legislation has changed, or the best practices have changed, or this is what some other organizations are doing with great success. And, it's easy enough for us, with a little bit of change, to implement these improvements. And ultimately, at the end of the day, yeah, and, I don't want to sound like a Hallmark greeting card, but at the end of the day, it's very true what the safety people say. It's, we want you to go home the same way you came into work, or at least
Mhm.
better, if not coming in the same way. And is, we want you to be as an effective worker and as an efficient worker as possible. And from my corner of the world, that is to make sure that your health and your safety is kept intact while you're working, which means, unfortunately, sometimes it's rules based. Well, these are the 10 steps to do this task safely, and if you
Mhm.
skip three of them, you shouldn't be surprised if you get hurt eventually as a result of that. So it's not to be the enforcer, though. I'd like to make that clear too, John, because sometimes safety people can get caught sort of into that enforcement role.
Yeah.
And it really isn't, like, from, at least from my point of view, I see a safety professional much more as the encourager, as the person that's working with everybody, maybe taking on, the lion's share of the work. But at the end of the day, if people accept it and start to use the tools that you're providing, it helps to make your workplace safely more safe, I should say. And I've seen that over the last 30 years, you know, in bits and pieces, unfortunately, not as a widespread success rate, but certainly
Mhm.
in pockets and corners, I've seen where the safety has been noticeably improved because the culture has changed, right? And the culture has changed because of that persistent approach to convincing people that this is the best way to do something safely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, something that I feel a lot of people get hung up on, and probably these would be the ones who fall more into the enforcement. The reason why are we doing this? And if you're pointing at, well, the regulations say you need to do it versus maybe a story about, something
Yeah.
that could actually happen to you and impact your life. Um, how have you kind of navigated that over the years?
They say, whoever they are, they say that storytelling is a powerful way to teach and to educate people. And I do believe in that, and I have used it, and it's typically it's past events. If it's something similar, I'll certainly use that, or
Mhm.
in a general sense, like, I've worked with people that didn't follow the rules and were seriously injured. And I try to convey that, like, what would your life be like if you were in the hospital for the next 6 weeks? How would your family get by? But you need to be careful with that, because you don't wanna come across as this maudlin sort of, "Oh, here comes Mr. Doom and Gloom," right? I
Right.
always joke that, because of the information we sometimes have to deliver, it's like the safety person is always invited to the company Christmas party the day after, right? Nobody wants to sit with us
Right.
because, we're always talking about what if. But, health and safety is basically a what if game. We look at a situation and we have to envision the absolute worst case scenario, and then work our way back to, what steps can we take to make sure that never happens. And that's where the challenge comes in, to tell somebody that may be working in an unsafe manner for, let's say, 10 years and nothing's ever happened to them. Try to convince them that, hey, this afternoon could be the time where your luck
Hmm.
changes. So I think, if you can use stories, again, I would caution the regulatory approach. I mean, I think there's a place for it, and I think that people need to be reminded that in the workplace, everything that we do that has a safety or a health component to it also has a legislative component to it. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remind people, hey, that there is a regulation, and if we don't follow it and you get hurt as a result, there's some legal trauma possibly following as well. We do have to be aware of that. Just like a business case for safety too, right? Some people respond to the money, some like management. Some people will respond to the regulatory. Other people will respond to this, what I would say is the common sense approach. Yeah, I know if I don't lock this out, even though I know I can beat the cycle, I know I'm putting myself at risk. And it's that complacency that I've always said is the number one hazard in any industry, in any workplace, right? It's that
Mhm.
belief that despite what I'm doing, nothing's going to happen to me, right? And we know on the balance of probabilities that that's how you approach work. It is only a matter of time before something does happen. So I
Yeah.
think you have to have a multifaceted approach when you come to the workforce as to how you promote health and safety.
So we had a guest on this show a while ago, Jason Brosen, and he shared his story. And to sum it up quite quickly, he was burned in an arc flash event. But he tells the story that he was doing something that he knew he shouldn't be doing. He knew there was an arc flash hazard. He knew he wasn't wearing any PPE, although he still decided to continue doing it. So something like that, that seemed to happen an awful lot, I would say. And you mentioned complacency as being the number one thing. How have you kind of helped deal with that over the years? Like, what can you do to?
I would say it comes back to communication and persistence. I think any health and safety person would tell you you can't rest on your laurels. If you've had a good day yesterday, you can't coast on that for the next month. You always have to come back and remind people. And it's not teaching somebody about arc flash safety because they know it. They could teach
Mhm,
me really, but it's to remind them, right? I see a lot of what we do as health and safety professionals as simply reminding people of what they already know. So we tend to be jacks of all trades, right? We're not necessarily proficient in many areas. We know a little bit about a lot.
mhm,
And I think on top of that is psychology, right? And they don't really teach that within the scope of health and safety. Well, they're starting to now, I think, with the mental health portion of health and safety. But psychology is really important. But why do people do what they do?
mhm,
Why does a competent, intelligent, mature adult with the training and the experience take that shortcut? What is it? Is it a perceived belief that they have to hurry up, which is the case in a lot of cases within manufacturing, where there's this sense I got to get X number of units done this hour, even if that's not what the company is asked for. Or, sometimes there's a disconnect between senior management and line management, right?
mhm,
Where senior management will almost always promote health and safety, but what about the supervisor on the floor or the manager on the floor that's under the gun, maybe to produce? And, a lot of times it's rushing. It's a lot of times, injuries are because people don't have the task on their mind. They've got other things going on. So it could be a variety of answers as to why people do what they do. And I think the best approach from a health and safety point of view is that consistent and persistent reminding of
mhm.
people, right? And beyond signs and beyond things like that, it's training. It's using again, it's using the different media that are available to us today, and even such as this, a podcast, to get that message out, to just remind people, you know
Yeah.
what? You've come into work today. We want you to do your best, right? And we don't want you to get hurt. And sometimes you'll hear people grumble, complain, well, management, they don't care. Well, they do. There's no management group out there that wants to see their workforce become injured or
Mhm.
become ill, and they put the resources in place. But ultimately, and of course, that's what the internal responsibility system's all about, is that ultimately we all share that responsibility for working safely. So, I think our role as a safety person is to be there in the front lines all the time to remind people, hey, don't stick your hand in there. Hey, don't mix those two chemicals. Hey, get
Mhm.
your safety glasses on. And it can become redundant. And sometimes there are days where you just think, why don't people listen? But, you know, everybody's got those sort of days, right? Ultimately, it's, when you see the people wearing their PPE and you see evidence that they're working safely, well, that's an affirmation, right? That at least we're helping to keep people safe in the workplace.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned management, and I know.
In a good way, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, and
Yes.
and 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 I guess what I'm thinking about is one of the challenges that I've seen, just from different companies that I've worked with, is deciding which direction to go. So with safety, you've got, you know, 25 different topics that you need to cover. And, imagine if you were starting at a newish company, maybe they have some safety, but not all the pockets.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, do you kind of have a thinking process you would go through to try to decide, well, which one do we tackle first? What's the most
Sure.
important thing?
I think what you would start is, risk assessment, like what are your highest hazard activities in your
Mhm,
facility or in your organization, and work back from there. I also like to take a look at what I sort of consider the pillars of a health and safety program. So you would look at health, safety, and the law. So what does the law in your jurisdiction actually require of you? Safety committees, and not
mhm,
just what are the laws around the safety committee, but how can you use a safety committee to your benefit, to the benefit of your organization? Hazard recognition, identification, recognition, assessing and controlling, investigations and inspections. And I've always said inspections are that proactive approach that we can take, whether it's a safety committee or other people in an organization, to identify the hazards,
mhm,
assess the controls, or if there are no controls, put controls in place. And then, despite your best efforts, if something goes wrong, how do you investigate it? What are the steps for the investigation? Who's doing the investigation? And what are you doing it for? Like, what are you producing as a result? Where you're
mhm,
producing recommendations, right, to make sure it doesn't happen again. So those are sort of the pillars of, and of course, WMIS. And then it depends on the organization. Some are more, some use more hazardous materials than others. But I think it's a good basic health and safety starting point for training. But again, you would take a look at what are the high hazards in that organization, right? If you have people working in a lot of confined spaces, well, we need to develop a confined space protocol right off the bat because we've got people in confined spaces. Or if it's forklift operations, if you've got large warehousing um, operations, if it's working at height, if it's working with chemicals, whatever the highest hazards or potential hazards would be, I would start with those certainly
mhm.
and then work backwards.
Okay, so you mentioned before we started recording that you're not an electrical safety expert and you're on an electrical safety podcast, but here would be the question that I'd want to ask you is, you've had some different places that you've worked over the years, so you've seen maybe some different things being done in the electrical safety space.
Yes.
But for those people out there listening that might be in your shoes where they don't have that background and they're responsible for health and safety and they're looking at, across the organization, it's like, well, what approach have you taken for that hazard? Um, yeah,
Well,
just
yeah, it's all about education, right? And so what I've done in the past is I've sought out the electricians in the organization. And I find if you approach anybody with an honesty about, look, my job is health and safety, and
hmm
I'm the first to say I don't know. All I know about electricity is not to stand in the water when I plug something in. I'm basically about that far into it, but
right.
I know it can be lethal, and yet I also know it's very beneficial. So I start off, what are your concerns? Like, what do you think we need to do to make our electrical safety? And, of course, I'm checking to see if we have a formal electrical safety program in
Yeah.
place. And a lot of times it's not formal, it's very informal. So
hmm
that's when I would go and approach the electricians and say, what can we do to make this safer for you, make it safer for the rest of the organization? And if I had to formalize what you're doing, which is what that's the easiest way to do it, right? How do you change a fuse right now? How do you enter a 650-volt box? Oh,
hmm
okay. Let me take down the steps. Let's review it. Does this make sense? Could we do it better? Could we do it more efficiently? And then you start to build your formal electrical safety program. But more importantly, I think, is you build that relationship with your maintenance staff or with your electricians to say, look, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not the expert. All I know is that we don't want anybody to get electrocuted. So I need you to help me to help you to work safely, right? So it becomes a partnership, really, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, that's actually a fantastic way to approach it, and that's been my experience as well,
Yeah.
is usually the electrical worker at the facility knows exactly what they need to do.
They're the experts, right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's fatal if you go in thinking just because I'm a safety professional or I've got
Yeah.
all these letters after my name, I know everything. And one thing I've learned over the years is I don't know a lot. So, but I do know how to ask and I do know how to approach people. And I'm okay to say, I don't know anything about your job other than it's potentially fatal. How can we work together to make it so it's not cumbersome, but at the same time, we're respecting the legislation, of course, but we're working safely. So if you're changing a fuse, if you need to restart a motor, if you have to access any kind of an electrical panel, are we doing it the safe way? If there is an arc flash concern, do we have the proper training? Do we have the proper signage? Do we have the right PPE? And do we know what the conditions could be? So again, it comes back to training, it comes back to communication, and it comes back to that persistence to, circle back 6 months later. How are things going? I haven't seen any or heard of any, complaints or anything. How are things?
Yeah.
And just review that on an annual basis at the very least.
Yeah. So, okay, because that was my next question, and um, thinking more about the frequency of communication and maybe the different styles of communication or different techniques you could use. I know with electrical safety training, the minimum requirement's every 3 years. And I always say to people,
Yeah.
I can't remember something I did 3 months ago, let alone 3 years. So,
Yeah. It's like first aid training, right? Like,
yeah,
6 months into it, it's like A, B, C, and something was about bleeding, I think. What was that again?
yeah,
It's if you're not practicing it on a daily basis, you can't forget it. So I'm a big fan of annual refresher training.
yeah,
Particularly for those legislated training requirements of 2 or 3 years. It's always good to do refresher training or even, informal on a monthly basis to take a look at a section of your policy or a section of the tasks that are being done. And really, again, it's talking to the people, right? Now, you're not
yeah,
going to talk to your electricians every single day because they'll run you out of the building. But you certainly let them know that you're available, and if they have any concerns that they can come to you anytime to vent even or to share what those concerns are. Because you're not just dealing with electrical safety, you're dealing with all other aspects of occupational health and safety. I think one of the most important things a safety person can do is to keep their door open, and let everybody in their organization know, look, I'm here. I may not be able to get you the answer immediately. I may not be able to do anything immediately other than to listen, jot it down, and I will certainly get to it as quickly as I can.
hmm,
And that, from my perspective, that served me pretty well over the years.
okay. So you mentioned, one of the things that you do is speaking and at conferences and that. Do you have a kind of a favorite couple of topics that you touch on?
Well, I have two. It's just by osmosis over the years, I've developed them into a conference material. Um, so they're my favorites only by default.
Mm,
One is I call it. I learned two many years ago. If you get a clever name for your presentation, conferences are more likely to to consider you. The first one is it's called Beyond the Coffee and Donuts: Effective Recipes for Effective Committees, and that came out of a health and safety committee meeting many years ago, where the members of that particular committee were kind of grumbling, well, we never do anything. It's always boring. So I thought, you know what? There are different things that we can try. And so I started to look back on my past, the different things that I've tried and different things that some of my colleagues have tried. And lo and behold, there was a presentation. And so
mm,
the original ones weren't the coffee and donuts. That's when I started to get a little bit more conference savvy. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I got to put a theme of some sort into this.
right.
And it's, I think I could say that even today I still pedal that. And, I get good feedback on it because what amazes me is that these ideas that have been around for 30 years are brand new to a lot of people when you
Yeah.
present. And every time I present it, somebody will go, I never knew that, or that sounds like such a great idea. So I think not to pat myself on the back by any means, because it's work that other people have done as well.
Right.
I've just sort of encapsulated. I'm like the Reader's Digest guy, right? I just
Yeah.
kind of put it all together and present it out to people. But they're ideas that have been tried and true. They're true and tried ideas, I guess. And there's maybe two that I've not personally done, but I've seen colleagues have great success with it. So I've put those in as well. The other one is on safety related discipline, which again came out of a meeting that I was asked to speak at many years ago on the issue. And what I've done with that one is I've taken some court cases and I've put them into the presentation, and I try to make it a little bit interactive with the group to say, okay,
Mhm.
here's what the court case was. How do you
Mhm.
rule? What level of discipline, if any, are you
Mhm.
going to put against this individual worker or workers? So I get everybody to discuss it. Then I show what the actual court ruling was, and then we have some more discussion after that. So that's an interesting one as well, just because it's more participatory with the attendees.
Yeah, no,
So
it sounds really neat. I do have a question on the coffee and donuts one.
yeah,
Um, so these are things that you've learned over the years that improve
yeah.
the actual committee meetings, or
Yeah, it's not guaranteed to be successful with every committee every time, but the are ideas that I have put into place or have had colleagues put into place with reasonable degrees of success.
yeah,
So, simple things like just perfect attendance recognition, right up to a program where you would have one first aid trained person and one safety committee person on duty. That's what it's called, for a
yeah,
week or a month, and they would have the permission that any minor first aid would get treated by that one person on duty, and any investigation would be done by the safety person.
right.
What that does, though, is that, again, from a communication standpoint, is it really enforces the health and safety of an organization. And that's not one that I've done, but a colleague of mine did this in Toronto and had great success with it, to the point where he had a lineup of people wanting to volunteer to
Hmm.
do it. And it gave the first aid person practical experience on an ongoing basis, and it gave the safety committee person, probably even more importantly, the investigative experience to
Hmm.
conduct, not on anything major, of course, but the minor bumps and scrapes that would happen at that particular place over time. Um, and of course, they're presented as a recipe, right?
Yeah,
So this is who it's for, this is what you need, and this is the outcome, right? This is the hopeful outcome anyway. So, and I'm not a baker. I'm horrible in the kitchen, but I know enough that a recipe, if you follow it, you're supposed to end up with a nice cake or pie or dinner.
yeah,
So that's the idea behind that particular one too. If you try any of these, safety committee recipes, at the very least, you'll start to rejuvenate your committee, and that's the whole point of that presentation. If your safety committee members are not engaged, if they roll their eyes every month when it's time for the safety meeting,
right.
and if the meeting's 10 minutes of just complaining or maintenance issues, well, you're losing a golden opportunity to sit and go, you know what? If we're the safety committee, what can we do to make our workplace safer and more enjoyable? So I believe if you can get your members engaged first and foremost, you'll certainly always end up with an effective committee after that.
Yeah, I've been places where I think the safety committee feels like they don't have much authority, and so how does that work in an organization?
Well, I always say when I'm talking to committees, or if I'm conducting the safety committee training that New Brunswick requires us to do, I'm always upfront. You as a safety committee, you don't have any authority. Your only authority is to make a written recommendation to management.
Right.
You're more of an advisory group. But if you're effective, your advisory group can hold quite a lot of influence within the company. But it's not an overnight deal. It's something that you have to work at. And again, you have to be persistent and you have to be consistent with your recommendations. You can't make recommendations that are not feasible to implement.
Yeah.
Uh, and just simple things that you have to meet consistently. You have to follow terms of reference. You have to have an agenda so that you're covering everything that you need to cover,
Hmm.
and you need to have time in your meeting to have those discussions. And I think, eventually you'll start to come up with recommendations that will not only make sense, but will actually be effective if they're implemented. And I've seen that over the years. I've seen what an effective committee can contribute to their organization. And that's what spurs me on all these years later, is I know it can work, and I committed to doing whatever I can to work with any safety committee to bring them up to that level. And that's what I'm currently doing in my position now is to work with the different committees to say, you know what, you guys could be so much more. And let me give you the tools, let me give you the encouragement. But again, that IRS sneaking in, you've got to meet me halfway, right? And
Right.
you've got to want to be effective. So
Great. So I guess on the conference topic, do you have anything coming up on the horizon that you're going to be speaking at?
I've put in applications, let's put it that
Yeah.
way. I haven't heard back. I'm supposed to hear back in the month of October.
Okay.
I've applied to, for the first time ever, I submitted those two topics to the American Society of Safety Professionals just for the experience. They're meeting next summer in Denver. Never been to Denver, so I thought,
Okay.
well, maybe make that a summer vacation. I have spoken at like the Safety Services Nova Scotia
Yeah.
conference, the Work Safe New Brunswick conference, several CSSE conferences, and the Partners in Prevention conference in Toronto over the last, I'd say, last 10, 15 years. Uh, I've been invited by some other groups to present to this. So not a conference per se, but like a company's safety day or
Mhm.
something that I've been asked by some organizations over the years as well. And always happy to comply. My boss is very generous in allowing me to do that. And again, it's again, going back to the radio and TV beginnings, it's to promote that idea that you can work safely and you can be
Mhm.
healthy at work. And though there's a lot of things that are sort of against us, if we follow the policies and procedures, if we wear our PPE correctly, if we are mindful of the tasks, and it becomes a challenge when you've been doing those tasks for many years and you're sort of on autopilot, it becomes a challenge to not let that get away from you and you end up being hurt. Um, Nobody sets out going to work in the morning with the expectation they're going to get hurt, before the day's out. And I think if you have that attitude, there's work that we need to do collectively to change that.
No, that's perfect. I think that's a great place to kind of end off. I guess, is there, if anyone did have some questions for you or they wanted some tips on, maybe their health and safety committee, maybe tips on putting together a program or that,
Yeah,
where would be the best place to reach out?
they could send me an email. It would
Or
be david-powers@hotmail.com. My daughter tells me that hotmail.com is quite old. It's for older people. So
yeah,
if there's any younger people wanting to contact me, my apologies for
yeah,
that. But it works. I'll get your
yeah.
message.
I've got a Hotmail account
Oh,
as
there
well.
you go. And you're young, John. You're young. So there's hope for me still.
Yeah. Great. Okay. No, thanks so much for having you. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you very much, John. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.